Good evening, everybody. And as always, a quick tech check to start with. Can everybody hear me okay?
Yes.
Awesome, awesome, awesome. So welcome everybody to our, I believe, seventh and final installment of True Religion, Righteous Converts, or Righteous Converts, True Religion, whichever one's supposed to come first. I am your host, Rabbi Pinchas Landis, and we are ready to rock and roll. So welcome everybody here with us on Zoom tonight. Welcome to everybody who is watching this on Facebook or on YouTube. And of course, welcome to everybody who later on will be watching this on TorahAnytime.com, where all of our wonderful classes are posted. So with no further ado, let's dive right into our final installment for this session. And then next week, we'll get geared up with our all-new session, which we will talk about towards the end of tonight. Okay. So as we've been talking about these different righteous converts throughout Jewish history, we've been slowly but surely making our way through Jewish history, starting with, I believe it was Ruth we started with. We started with the concept of conversion. Then we talked about Ruth as the first recorded convert in the Torah and the Bible. And, slowly but surely making our way through Jewish history. Now, finally, our discussion comes to this country, to this land, to this favored land of the United States of America. It was not planned by any way, shape, or form that this would be done the night before the presidential inauguration, but definitely it's interesting that here on a very auspicious time in the country, as we see the transfer of power from, one very different president, one president to another president of very different approaches. And we are now going to talk a little bit tonight about the Jewish experience in America, the relationship between America and Israel, and kind of where it all started, because it started with a very unassuming of characters, as we will see, a man by the name of Warder Cression. Now, a lot of what we're going to say tonight might sound familiar if you were at the Partners in Torah annual fundraiser, I believe 2018, when we were at Lander Haven, where we had Michael Medved as our scholar in residence, as our guest speaker. So Michael at that time gave a wonderful talk about the relationship between Israel and America, and a lot of the wonderful things we've seen over the years of the relationship. And it was a prelude in many ways to a book of his that came out a short time later called God's Hand on America, Divine Providence in the Modern Era. And I have to say, this is by no way of exaggeration, and I mean this just in complete honesty, it is one of my favorite books of all time. It's actually a sequel to another book that Michael Medved put out called The American Miracle, which talks about divine providence and the founding of America's republic. And this is the sequel, God's Hand on America, which takes you, so basically the first book goes up through essentially Lincoln's assassination, Civil War, Lincoln's assassination, and the second book picks up from there and comes up into the modern era. So I put the link there to the book, the Amazon link for God's Hand on America. You can also find The American Miracle. Awesome books, highly recommended, and just show some of the amazing experiences that this country has had over the past almost 250 years. So the second book, God's Hand on America, will be the basis for a lot of what we'll talk about tonight, because my first exposure to Warder Cression was when Mr. Medved spoke at the Partners in Torah event in 2018, but I subsequently got the book when it came out, and since it's been a toss-up for me which one I like better, the first book or the second book. They are both highly, highly recommended, absolutely amazing. If you need something to just give you that, extra boost of faith that you need, first of all, that there is an Almighty in this world running things from above, and that America plays a very special place in his plan. If you need a boost in the belief of that, just get either one of these books and check them out. But that will be a lot of the source material for what we'll talk about tonight comes from the book God's Hand on America. Okay, so the time period that we are talking is well, first of all, Warder Cression is born in 1798, so towards the dawn of the 19th century. And and as we mentioned, we're going to talk very much about the relationship, the early relationship between the land of Israel and America. Now, the land of Israel was not called Israel by the Hamonam, as we would say at that point. It was not called Israel by the nations of the world. But as I always point out, the number one rule in debate is to never use the terminology of your opponent, because once you use the terminology of your opponent, you are de facto conceding a point. So I will never refer to the land of Israel by the name Palestine. The land of Israel was never called Palestine to Jews. Yes, it was legally called. Palestine by first the Romans, who, as we've talked about before, they gave the country the name Palestine to make it Judenrein, to destroy the Jewish character of the land, to make it as if it was not a Jewish place. And that name stuck from the time of the destruction, really from the Bar Kokhba revolt in 135 until modern times. But we claim that there was never a separation between the Jewish people and the land of Israel. So therefore, we always call it Israel, right? We call it Israel from the time of Abraham, okay, at least from the time the Jews went in until modern times. So that's the area we're talking about right now. We're talking about Israel. We're talking about Israel under modern rule, under Ottoman rule, and it's really at a time which we would refer to as the sunset of the Ottoman Empire, or as the Ottoman Empire was called at this time period, the sick man in Europe, because everybody knew that the Ottoman Empire was faltering at this time in the 19th century. It would just take about 100 years to play out. It wouldn't be until the Ottoman Empire picks the wrong side in World War I, which, by the way, wasn't so simple on their part, because both sides were wooing the Ottoman Empire. And in the end, the Ottomans picked the wrong side. They picked the Germans and the Austrians, and that was the end of the Ottoman Empire. But already in the 19th century, all the nations of the world were basically laying stake, or being preemptive and laying stake to different parts of the Ottoman Empire. And a very coveted part of the Ottoman Empire was the land of Israel. Now, not because of any other reasons than its both historical and religious significance. There's a wonderful book by Barbara Tuchman called The Cross and the Sword, I believe, or I believe it's called The Cross and the Sword. It tells about the relationship between Britain and Israel going back hundreds of years, thousands, really 2,000 years almost. And how when the British got involved with Israel, it was not just a political move, it was very much a religious move. And that was already happening in the 19th century. But what's interesting is that the land as a region was, let's just say, not so sought after as a place to live in. And even though it's at this time where we already have a trickle of Jews coming back, we're going to be right in the time period of what's called the first Aliyah, when Jews start making their way back to Israel. Here is what some tourists to Israel, because the idea of tourism to Israel had started to pick up. It was mainly religious pilgrims, mainly Christian religious pilgrims, with some Jewish religious pilgrims going to visit the land of Israel. And there was a certain man by the name of Samuel Clemens who decided he would go with some of those religious pilgrims to check out the land of Israel. If you know anything about American literature, you know that Samuel Clemens was the real name for an author who used the pen name Mark Twain. So here's what Mark Twain has to say about visiting the land of Israel in 1867. He writes, "A desolate country whose soil is rich enough, but is given over wholly to a weedless, silent, mournful expanse. A desolate is here that not even imagination can grace with the pomp of life and action. We never saw a human being on the whole route. There was hardly a tree or a shrub anywhere. Even the olive and the cactus, those fast friends of the worthless soil, had almost deserted the country." So that's what Israel looked like in the 19th century. Now, part of it is because at its core, it's a desert. The other part of it is because the Ottoman Empire had totally destroyed whatever there was of the land. If you ever wondered why, when the Jewish National Fund comes around in the early 20th century, that one of their main programs is to plant a tree in Israel, that's not because it's a desert, and that's not because we turned a desert into an oasis, which we did, but even the parts of the land that were not a desert were completely deforested, if that's a word. Basically, all the trees had been cut down by the Ottomans. So the land was badly in need of trees, and places that didn't even need the agricultural miracles that would eventually happen. But the land was, just as Mark Twain describes, absolutely desolate. There's a good reason why no one lived there. There's a good reason why no one wanted to live there. And that's the Israel that we're going to talk about tonight. And we're going to talk about the relationship between that land and the country of America, where we all live right now. So our protagonist, our character that we're going to look at tonight, as I mentioned, is Warder Cression. Warder Cression was born in 1798. He was born a Quaker, and he was the second of 8 children. And as many Quakers did in those times, they originally came from Holland. The family came from Holland. They initially went to Delaware, then New York, and settled where all of the entirety of the Quaker community of America ended up settling, none other than Philadelphia. And like many Quakers, the Cression family became very successful. The Quakers were known to be tremendous farmers. They made oats and other things. And many of them became very wealthy in these early days of the country, just after the Revolutionary War and the beginning of the development of this republic. And Warder was no exception to this. At the age of 17, he already was very involved in the family business, working on the farms. He impressed people with his business know-how and his ingenuity and his leadership. He was married at the age of 23 to a fellow religious Quaker, a girl named Elizabeth Townsend, and he himself had 6 children. Now, by the age of 30, so roughly in the year 1828, Cression had started to have religious doubts in his Quaker upbringing. He started to question his Quaker faith. Now, his main issue was an issue that comes up with many people when they start to question their religion, and that is that they see a certain doctrine being preached in the church or the house of worship, but they don't see it practiced in the street by their co-religionists. And that's exactly what Cression saw. He saw that the people of Quaker faith were espousing certain things, but did not live their life in such a way. As the Talmud would say it, as Pirkei Avos would say it, a person has to be toho kiboro, that their inside has to be like their outside. And that's how a Jew should be. But what Cression experienced is that was not how the Quakers were. And it made him question his religion. It made him ultimately abandon his religion. And from that point on, he goes on essentially we'll call it a trial of religions. He first joins up with the Shakers, then the Mormons, then the Seventh-day Adventists, then the Campbellites, who I never heard of before until I heard of Warder Cression, but that was a group that was really trying to bring Christianity back to what it was before Saul or Paul. In other words, they would still observe the Torah, but they believed Jesus was the Messiah. And that's what the Campbellites believed in. And this was sort of his revolving door of trying to find the right religion, of trying to find the truth. In his exploration for the truth, he ended up in the Mikveh Israel Synagogue, which was the largest synagogue in Philadelphia at that time, and became connected to a rabbi by the name of Rabbi Isaac Lesser, who was lauded as an early American rabbi, a forerunner or a pioneer of what we would today call the modern Orthodox world. And the synagogue received a very warm reception. Now, let me just give a little bit more of a picture of who Warder Cression was at this time. It wasn't enough for him to just be on a religious odyssey, on a religious journey, trying to find his true faith, trying to find what he believed in. He made a point of whatever he believed in on any given day, he wanted the world to believe in it too. Now, he was a very imposing figure. He had a long biblical, what we would call a rabbinical beard. He had sharp blue eyes. And he would stand in the streets of Philadelphia, literally taunting passersby about the imminent apocalypse, about how people had to improve their behavior, about how people had to become believers. Like, that's the kind of character we're dealing with. He was a well-known person. He was an affluent person, and he was known for being extremely wealthy and extremely eccentric. So when he walks into the synagogue, they knew who he was, and the rabbi could have just as easily said, like, we don't want this guy in our shul. We don't want this guy here. But Rabbi Lesser did the opposite. He gave a very warm response to Warder Cression. He welcomed him into the synagogue, even though it was known to all that he was a Gentile. And they began a friendship and a relationship of study. In that relationship, Rabbi Lesser introduced Cresson to the writings and the teachings and the lessons of Mordechai Emanuel Noach. Mordechai Emanuel Noah was one of the original, what we call the proto-Zionists. We're in a time period now known as proto-Zionism because Zionism doesn't officially start till Herzl comes along. Herzl's not even born until 1860. The first Zionist Congress is 1898, and we're a good half a century before that. So anybody during this time period who was espousing the ideas of the Jews returning to the land of Israel, of the Jews having sovereignty in the homeland, in our homeland of Israel, the term that historians refer to them as is proto-Zionists. So the most affluent, really I think just about the only proto-Zionist in America was Mordechai Emanuel Noah. Now there are famous ones from England. There is, of course, Montefiore, Sir Moses Montefiore, of whom our nursing home here in Cleveland is named, one of our nursing homes. And there are very famous religious leaders, the Baal Shem Tov, the Vilna Gaon, that were encouraging their students to go to the land of Israel. But the only, to the best of my knowledge, the only American proto-Zionist is Mordechai Emanuel Noah, who was one of the first prominent Jews in America. And he was of Sephardic descent, like just about all the Jews were at that time, Portuguese Sephardic descent. And in his prominence, he developed a idea that the Jews needed a safe haven in America. And to that end, he purchased an island known as Grand Island, which is just off of, it's in the Niagara River, just off of, stone's throw away from Buffalo. And he named that little settlement Ararat. Now, Ararat is the name of the mountain that Noah, the original Noah, as in Noah and the Ark, that's the mountain that he lands on after the flood subsides. So that is where this Noah, Mordechai Emanuel Noah, took the name Ararat from, with the idea that just like that was the original Noah's salvation, this would be his salvation. And he bought the land up at the price of about $5 a square acre, and he proclaimed that this would become the Jewish settlement. No one really cared. No one listened to him. No one went there. It didn't really work. Not much came of it. So he was the governor of Ararat, the idea did not go very far. But in the preparation and planning and buying and espousing this idea, it slowly but surely transitioned into proto-Zionism. And he ended up saying that, you know what, America is not going to be our end-all be-all. It's going to be the land of Israel. And the Jews must return to the land of Israel. We must take sovereignty again over the land of Israel. And that will be where the Jewish people will find their ultimate salvation. And these ideas of Mordechai Emanuel Noah had a profound impact on Warder Cresson. So here's Warder Cresson, this eccentric man searching for the true religion. He's influenced by this Rabbi Lesser. He's influenced by these ideas of Mordechai Emanuel Noah, and he comes to this conclusion. He comes to the conclusion that there's no salvation for the Gentiles and anywhere else in the world but to come to Israel. And the whole reason that God gave America to the Americans and that God put his providence on the country of America was so that America could save the Jews of the world from oppression. That was his conclusion. And by the way, I don't think he was necessarily wrong on that. I don't think, right? He's maybe not too far afield. As I've said many times, that the Jewish people have never had it as good as we have it today in America, not at any point in our exile. The Medina Shel Chesed, the country of kindness that America is, far exceeds any other place we have been in this exile. So along those lines, Cresson came to the conclusion that the whole reason that America was there at all, and you have to remember the timing here. America at this point is not even a century old. He's writing this and roughly, this is taking place in the year 1840, 1842. Like the country isn't even 100 years old yet, and this is the conclusion that Cresson comes to. Cresson was in many ways an early entrepreneur and had really outlandish ideas. And at that point, he saw that his goal with all of his purpose on this planet, all of his wealth, was to help the Jewish people. In what capacity? Help the Jewish people to return to the land of Israel, to settle the land of Israel, and he dedicates the rest of his life to that cause. So as a very young man, very wealthy, but a young man with an ambitious dream, he reaches out to a man by the name of E. Joy Morris, who was a local congressman in Philadelphia at that time. And he asks Representative Morris if he, Cression, can be appointed as the first consul to Jerusalem. Right? He says, you know what? Jerusalem is a very important place, and we should have a consul there. And I want to be that consul. I want to be the consul there. Now, if you don't know what a consul is a diplomat that takes care of the needs of their fellow countrymen when they visit certain countries. So in this case, if Cression was going to be the consul in Jerusalem, the idea is he would take care of the needs of Americans when they came to visit Jerusalem. Now, we describe what Israel looked like at that time by Mark Twain's remarks. The country or the region as a whole had, the city of Jerusalem as a whole, which is really the only city with a major population at that point. There's already a community in Tzfat, and there is a community in Jaffa before Tel Aviv, but really Jerusalem is about the only place where there are people in the land of Israel. And there's maybe 15,000 people in total living in Israel at that time. By the way, and this is a very important point, if this is all you remember tonight, walk away with just this point, half of those 15,000 were Jews. So already in the mid 18th century, you had half of the population of Jerusalem was Jewish, and by the mid-19th century, it's going to be an overwhelming majority of Jerusalem will be a Jewish population. So if anyone wants to tell you that the Jews only got Jerusalem in 1967 or 1948, it's malarkey, right? It's garbage. It's not true. By the mid-19th century, there's already at least half of the population, only 15,000 people, but at least half of the population is Jewish, and by the mid-19th century, it's overwhelmingly a Jewish city. So it's a tiny city. As we described from Mark Twain, it's a backwater part of the Ottoman Empire. It's disgusting, it's decrepit, it's dirty, it's grimy. In many ways, it's hardly deserving of a consulate. Usually, at least at that time, consulates went to places where Americans would visit, and the Americans needed to be serviced. And that was just it seemed not to be the case in Jerusalem. Nonetheless, Morris writes to John C. Calhoun, the Secretary of State, and he says, it might be a good idea for us to open a consulate in Jerusalem because, let's face it, there is an increasing number of Americans, American pilgrims, American missionaries going to the land of Israel, as Mark Twain was a part of, not as a missionary necessarily, but that's who he caravanned with. We could benefit from a diplomatic outpost there. And by the way, I think it should be Warner Crescent to do this, and he's willing to do it for free. He's willing to do it without taking a penny from the country. So at that point, the State Department was quite strapped for cash, and the idea of being able to have a consulate without having to pay for it was an appealing idea to Calhoun, and Calhoun acquiesced. And he, on May 17th, 1844, he appoints Warder Crescent, our man seeking truth, as the first consul to the city of Jerusalem. Now, if you look up May 17th, 1844, on the Jewish calendar, the Jewish date was Chaf Ches Iyar, was the 28th day of the month of Iyar. Does anybody know where in just 133 years after that point, why that day is significant? Because that's the day that in the Six-Day War that the Israelis reconquer the city of Jerusalem. The old city of Jerusalem is conquered on Chaf Ches Iyar. That is known today as a national holiday in Israel, as Yom Yerushalayim, Jerusalem Day, because that's the day when the Israeli army reconquered the old city. And again, I always say there's no coincidences in life. 133 years before that, that was the day that America appoints the first consul to the city of Jerusalem in Warder Crescent. Okay? So Warder Crescent immediately makes plans to depart from Philadelphia for the land of Israel, and he takes care of all his business dealings, gives power of attorney to his wife and to members of his family. And he writes, And he leaves very shortly for the land of Israel. And he wrote at that time, in the spring of 1844, I left everything near and dear to me on earth. I left my wife of my youth and 6 lovely children and an excellent farm with everything comfortable around me. I left all these in pursuit of truth and for the sake of truth alone. So it was clear that Warden Cression was clearly on a mission. He was clearly on a spiritual journey, and he was off on a British ship to the land of Israel. It is printed in the papers at that time that the first consul to the city of Jerusalem, Warden Cression, is been appointed, and it's being celebrated in the press. People who knew Cression, though, and you can imagine as we've described this man, people who knew Cression were not so into this idea of Cression representing their country in the Middle East. Samuel D. Ingham, who was a former congressman and former secretary of Treasury under Andrew Jackson, protested to Calhoun. And he said his passion is for religious controversy, a theme of ridicule to all who know him. He's a religious fanatic. We don't want this guy as an American diplomat. I don't care who's paying for it. We don't want it. What the papers have said has made America a laughing stock. Calhoun Calhoun's opinion was affected by this by Ingham's letter and by other similar letters, and he subsequently appeals to the president, and they have the consul rescinded from Cression. They send notice to Philadelphia only to find out that Cression has already left for the land of Israel. Okay? So now we have a dilemma that before Cression even sets foot on the Holy Land, he has his position as the consul to Jerusalem, the American consul to Jerusalem, has already been rescinded. Okay. After the cross of the transatlantic journey, Cression arrives at the port of Jaffa, and in the melodramatic entry to the port, he is carrying in his right hand an American flag, and in his left hand a dove of peace. And he establishes himself as the representative of the United States of America. He creates a new seal for this, and he issues a proclamation. Shortly after arriving, he issues a proclamation to the Jews of Jerusalem and says to them, from this point forward, you, as residents of Jerusalem, as Jewish residents of Jerusalem, have the protection and will enjoy the protection of the government of the United States of America. Now, his proclamation would never really have any teeth, because shortly after he starts to establish himself, the letter arrives to say that his appointment has been canceled. Now, this was only a minor inconvenience for Cression, because he enjoyed the title consul to the city of Jerusalem too much, and he continued to use it. And the Ottomans just shrugged it off. They didn't really care too much. And there were no other American officials going to the Middle East at those times to ask the serious questions to bring the whole thing into jeopardy. So Cression goes on functioning as the consul to the city of Jerusalem, representing the country of America. And he continues to welcome all kinds of visiting dignitaries in the name of the United States of America. And with all these visiting dignitaries, he shared his wild plans for the reconfiguring of the Middle East and ultimately the entire world. That Israel would become a Jewish state, the Jews of the exile, of all the downtrodden places in the exile that they were in, would come back, and there would once again be a Jewish homeland on their ancestral homeland, on their biblical ancestral homeland. And when British officials would come to the land of Israel, he would promise them that the U.S. would work very closely with the United Kingdom to establish the Jewish homeland in the land of Israel. And he would write back to America and insist that his articles be circulated throughout America in glowing accounts of how wonderful the holy city was. Very different than the account that we see from the same time from Mark Twain, because he wanted everybody to fall in love with Israel, and specifically with the city of Jerusalem. Okay, I'm gonna take a pause now for any questions that we have. Let me see. We have some things here in the chat. Okay, so Mikhail gave us an Amazon free place to get that book. Okay, you can check that out. And let's just go to gallery mode here and see, are there any questions at this point? Any points of clarity before we go on with our story? Okay. Hey, Michael.
Hi. It's funny that there's this narrative out there that Jews abandoned what we call modern day Israel and left it to the Arabs of the area. And yet there's so much historical conclusive proof. I can't understand why people would come up with this alternate narrative to be easily refuted.
It's very simple, Michael, because as my father, who's at least on my screen, is right above you.
Yes, Kerry.
Box right above you. As my father always said, when the facts are with you, you pound the facts. When the facts are against you, you pound your fist. And that's what it is. It's a canard. It's a lie. It's not true. Right. So as I talked about, if you follow the Back to the Past podcast, we talked about this in last week's episode, how from the time period of the rise of Christianity, or the Roman Empire becoming the Holy Roman Empire, that was the beginning of the end of the Jews in Israel. Originally, Constantine leads the first, what we'll call pre-crusade to the land of Israel, and Theodosius and others, they make Israel completely Judenrein at that point. Roughly by the year 350, 400, there's not any Jews left in Israel, but there is always a presence of Jews in Israel from that point on. And we see that every time the Jews make a stop in exile, as we'll see, and get kicked out different places, there's always a movement to go back in Israel. And we see that most specifically when the first time we see it is when Nachmanides is kicked out of Spain in the 12th century. We see it after the Spanish expulsion in the 15th century. And that by the time we got over here to the 17th and 18th century and in the 19th century, the only one who's really there are Jewish idealists, because it's not a country you can live in. Right? It's a backwater, neglected part of the Ottoman Empire. Right. Never made a capital by the Ottoman Empire. Never treated seriously by the Ottoman Empire. The Ottomans didn't particularly care about it. The Dome of the Rock was there, but it was not really considered a very holy place in Islam. It had already been identified as Al-Aqsa, which is not true in the Quran, by the way. The Quran does not identify Al-Aqsa, which means the place, as Jerusalem. That was the Imam Omar who did it after Muhammad's life. But it was not a part of the empire. It wasn't taken seriously. The only people who took it seriously were the Jews. And like I said, by the 18th century, the small population of Jerusalem is at least half Jewish. By the 20th century, did people's audio stop? Is anyone having audio trouble?
No.
Okay. It looks like Rachel is. I apologize, Rachel. You might want to sign out and sign back in, and see if that works. But you have that, and here's, and I don't want to get too far afield, but you brought the point up, so what the heck? When we talk about the Arab immigration to Israel, when does that start? That's not here. That's not under the Ottomans. What happens? It happens at the time of the first Aliyah. Why? Because in the first, I believe it was for sure the first Aliyah, I think the second Aliyah, and I think it finally changes in the third Aliyah. I might have my numbers wrong, but what happens is, and we're going to talk about this in a moment, the Jews are, basically find when they get to Israel that they can hire cheap help by way of the local Arabs. And the word spreads throughout the Ottoman Empire, which, the subjects of the Ottoman Empire are not treated too well, that there's job opportunities in what they called Palestine. And there's Jews there spending money from Europe to build up the land. And unfortunately, for better or for worse, what happens is the Arabs come in numbers of 3-1 to Israel during the first Aliyah, not for any other reason, but there are Jewish job opportunities there for the Arabs. So when we talk about today, the conflict that we have, which I don't want to minimize it, it is a conflict. And it's something that we have to take seriously, and we have to work to try and find a resolution to. And, Baruch Hashem, thank God, in the past year, we've seen tremendous strides in that direction of compromise and agreements and agreements made that we just, a year ago, we never, for sure 2 years ago or 4 years ago, we never thought would come to fruition. And all of a sudden we have such things happening. So I don't want to minimize the conflict because of the origins of the conflict. But anytime you have a conflict, it's important to know the origins. And the origins of this conflict are that Jews based on Zionistic dreams, Messianic dreams, Jews started going back to Israel, and that presented job opportunities for local Arabs through the neighboring regions of the Ottoman Empire who were treated terribly, and that's why they start moving. And what causes the conflict is their numbers are 2 times, 3 times what the Jews were, because they hey, I guess money speaks louder than idealism, and the only thing driving the Jews was idealism, but the thing that was driving the Arabs was a better life, was monetary improvement to their life, and you can't blame people for that. But that's the source, that's the origins of our modern day conflict. It's important to keep that in mind when we talk about it. So, yeah, but you're right. You're right, Michael, that it's the facts, the historical facts are not on the side of, let's say, Yasser Arafat, Yamach Shemo, when he spoke in the United Nations and talked about, the ancestral claims that the Palestinian people had to land of Israel. It's just not true. And unless you come from a few Bedouin nomadic tribes, right? It's just not true. It's just not.
As you mentioned earlier, it only took 133 years between the time that Cression was appointed before Jerusalem was unified. It's happening sooner, thank goodness, that the Arab world is starting to recognize the truth.
Yeah, and it should only continue.
That's amen. Baruch Hashem.
It should only, is right. Baruch Hashem is right. Thank God is right, and should only continue because whatever up to 3 or 4 countries of the Arab League is huge. It's a lot more than than we had 2 years ago. But how many countries are there in the Arab League? I believe it's 33. So I think we have like 4 down, 29 to go.
Baby steps.
What's that?
Baby steps.
Exactly. But we got big ones, though. A lot of them are, as I've said, I'm sure that the Almighty was really holding his breath for Bahrain. Now that Bahrain's on board, like now the Messiah can come, now the Mashiach can come. Right? But let's face it, UAE is huge. So Mikhail says it's 5 countries right now. UAE is huge. Morocco is huge. Hopefully Saudi Arabia is pretty close, and that's just a game changer. So God willing, it should continue, and we should see it happen. So yeah. So okay, so that's the Jerusalem that we're talking about here. That's the Jerusalem where Warder Crescent is living. So okay. In 1848, March 28th, 1848, at the age of 49, Warder Crescent decides that the purpose of his life is not to serve the land of Israel and the Jews of the land of Israel and represent America as a Gentile, but it has to be done as a Jew. And through these 4 years he had been living in the city of Jerusalem, he had developed a relationship with the chief Sephardic rabbi of the city. And on March 28th, 1848, Warder Crescent becomes Michael Boaz Yisrael ben Avraham. He converts to become a Jew. And from that point on, starts to live life as a Jew. Now, this whole time, did
his whole family go with him, or just he himself lived there?
So this whole time, that's exactly where we're going. You're reading my notes, Michael. I think you hacked into my computer.
You can send me the check tomorrow.
Exactly. Made out to Israel bonds, right? So this whole time, these whole 4 years, he is keeping his wife in the loop. He is keeping his children in the loop. Some of his children are not so young anymore, right? If his first children were born when he was 25, he's 49. His children are grown up at this point. And the whole time he's kept them abreast by what he's been doing. He's been writing back or at least writing to them, keeping them informed of his happenings. They are all still in Philadelphia. And he does not hide from them the fact that he converted to become a Jew, and that his new name is no longer Warder, but he's now Michael Boaz Yisrael. And he had no intentions at any point of abandoning his family, and he truly thought that he'd be able to convince his family. He thought his family would come on board once he found the truth, and that is what he thought what would happen. So now that he had completed his conversion process, now that he's Michael Boaz Yisrael, he heads back to America for the sole purpose of gathering his family and bringing them back to Jerusalem, hopefully also as Jews. So no less than 2 months after his conversion, he arrives back in Philadelphia, and he has a devastating reception from his nearest and dearest. His wife, Elizabeth, had used her power of attorney to take possession of everything that they had. She had sold the family farms. She had sold all of his possessions. And as much as Michal Boaz Yisrael begged for at least some sort of settlement, that he should have some financial relief from this process, she not only refused, but she lodged charges of lunacy against him, to which his own family participated in. So now you have Michal Boaz Yisrael coming back to Philadelphia, thinking that he's going to convince his family to join him, thinking that he's going to collect his wife and his 6 children and now their families, take them back to Jerusalem to fulfill his true dream. And instead, his wife and his family has him charged with the charges of lunacy, of insanity, as we would say in modern terms. He is found guilty by a 6-man, what we call a sheriff's jury. They found him guilty of insanity, but he appeals to the courts to say that I never spent a day in an asylum. I was never diagnosed by any psychiatrist, or I think that was before psychology, but by any psychiatrist as a lunatic, as an insane man. I am appealing these charges. And the trial that would follow would take almost 3 years from beginning to end. Over 100 witnesses would be called. It was about 4 years, Dan, that he was separated from his family. So the trial, his appeals trial, would take 3 years. Over 100 witnesses would be called, and it became a national sensation. And the question, quite simply, was this: could the government question a man's midlife decision? Can the government question a man's decision to convert, which was essentially the issue? He was fiercely defending his right to convert, because that ultimately, 1844. So we had the idea of that psychiatry, though. I said psychology, I don't think had been developed as a science or been worked into the books yet at that point. I could be wrong. I'll leave Joanne to Google that while we go on. But that was the question. The question was not necessarily if Michal Boaz Yisrael, formerly Warder Crescent, was insane. I think everyone knew him, knew he was a little different, knew he was a little bit eccentric, but no one knew he was no one necessarily thought he was crazy. But the question on the table was that it's crazy for a wealthy Quaker man at the age of 50 to convert to be a Jew. Why would anyone want to be a Jew? And that was the question on the American court dockets that lasted for 3 years, that saw over 100 witnesses. The witnesses entailed physicians for both yay and nay, theologians for both yay and nay, legal scholars, both yay and nay, testifying on both sides, testifying that a man would be insane to convert to Judaism in his 50s. And others saying, no, a man, it's his freedom of choice, it's his free speech. He can become a Jew if he wants to become a Jew at any point in his life. And his lawyer did an unbelievable job of defending him. And in his closing argument, he talked about how obscene it was to discredit an unconventional thinker on the grounds of his religious decision. That the only thing that Crescent did wrong was to become a Jew. And at this point, the newspapers had swung completely in his favor, and eventually he is found to be not insane, right? The charges of insanity are dropped. The case of insanity against him is dropped, and he is legally free to live as a Jew, to practice as a Jew, and no longer to be bothered by this sentence of insanity, which would have ultimately forced him to be committed to a mental institution. Now, the Philadelphia newspapers lauded this decision. They said it's settled forever that a man's religious opinion never can be made the test of his sanity. So our Warder Crescent turned Michal Boaz Yisrael set a tremendous legal precedent in 1848 to say that a person changing their religion at any point in their life is not grounds for insanity. It might be grounds for a midlife crisis, but it's not grounds for insanity. Within a year of the end of the trial, in 1852, he divorces his wife, obviously, and goes now penniless back to the land of Israel. But this time he has a new dream. He's no longer claiming to be the consul to Jerusalem. He's no longer claiming to represent the country of America. He is representing one thing and one thing only, and that is the Jewish people. And his goal from this point on, what he dedicates the rest of his life to, is restoring the people of Israel by restoring the land of Israel. Cression believes that through reworking the land and rebuilding the land and using modern farming technology and cultivating the land and sprouting the desert, as the prophets talk about, that is what will bring out the Jewish soul, and that's what will inspire Jews to return to the land of Israel. Now, this might sound a little bit familiar, and he's often
not. What year was that? 18 what?
1852. So I know where where Michael's going with this. Cression is often not given the credit as being the father of the modern kibbutz movement, but you see here very much that he was the first person ever to talk about the idea of agricultural settlements in the land of Israel and to promote the idea. And later on, we're going to see that Montefiore starts to buy into it, and Rothschild buys into it. And while in Cression's lifetime, the idea didn't go very far, at least philosophically, he was the first one to really have the idea of what we would call the modern day kibbutz.
And also remember, since you mentioned it earlier about JNF, but that comes in 1901.
1901, right. It comes at the Third Zionist Congress.
But that may also influence Herzl in the late 1800s as he grows up.
Right, exactly. So the Jewish National Fund is started in 1901, and just a quick trivia question along those lines: what does the first JNF pushka look like? No, it was not a little blue box. You might have thought it was, but it wasn't. You know what it was? It was Herzl's hat. Right, Herzl took off his hat at that Zionist Congress in 1901 and passed it around.
Passed the hat. Right.
And passed the hat, exactly. Passed the hat to start the Jewish National Fund. I think it was about 2 months later they designed the blue box. So ever since then, it's been the blue box. But the first one was Herzl's hat. Okay, so Cression, back in Israel now, penniless, trying to push his idea of rebuilding the Jewish people through rebuilding the land of Israel, remarries to a nice Sephardic woman. He has 3 children with his new wife and lives out the rest of his days as a religious Jew, promoting this idea. Shortly after his return to Jerusalem, his marriage to his wife, and the building of his new family, he is visited by an American novelist who is intrigued by these ideas of improving the Jewish people by improving the land of Israel. And the novelist has an audience with Cression to think and to hear his ideas. He tours the land of Israel, optimistic, but as soon as he starts to look around, he sees the land of Israel that Mark Twain saw at the same time. And he writes that no country will more quickly dissipate romantic exception than Palestine, particularly Jerusalem. In other words, it was a buzzkill. This was not what I expected, writes this American novelist. Michael Oren, in one of his books, writes that he feels that this novelist was just disgruntled by the poor sales of his most recent novel that was called Moby Dick. And of course, we're talking about Herman Melville. So Herman Melville has a similar experience in the land of Israel that Mark Twain has, writing it off. He has an audience with Cression, and he thinks Cression's crazy. He says, Cression, this isn't going to work. This isn't going to work to develop the land of Israel. He says, first of all, the land of Israel is a desert. Right? You can't have a farm in the desert. We all know you can't have a farm in the desert, right? That's number one. Number two, Jews hate farming, which is true, right? Jews hate farming. It took a long time for Jews to get into the idea of farming. Ultimately we did it, but it took a while, right? Number 3, says Melville to Cression, is there is not enough Jews in the land of Israel at this time to get it going. There are maybe 10,000 Jews in the land of Israel, and it won't be enough to get it going. And therefore, there's not going to be anything to influence the Jews of the diaspora to come back to the land of Israel. Says Melville, in his own words, it would take a miracle for the Jews at this point to resettle the land of Israel. And that's maybe what it took. Cression was not deterred by Melville, was not deterred by anybody, and not deterred by the fact that, for the most part, he did not get anywhere with his plans and his life. Unfortunately, at the age of 62, he he became sick with some unknown malady, some unknown illness, and the illness took his life within 10 days of becoming diagnosed and going into the hospital at the age of 62. When he passed away, he received the honors in Jerusalem that only great rabbis received. All the businesses were closed the day of his funeral. There was a large procession that escorted his body to the Mountain of Olives where he was buried. Unfortunately, his children also passed away within 3 years of his passing. So from roughly 1860 on, from 1865 on, there were very few people in Jerusalem to memorialize Michal Boaz Yisrael in any way, shape, or form. And until modern times, his grave was unknown, because if you've ever been on the Mountain of Olives, you know it is very hard to find a grave on the Mountain of Olives if you don't know where you're looking. In 2013, someone discovered his gravesite. Someone found the stone and was still legible. Here, I'll bring up a picture of it right now. It was still clear that it was the gravestone of Michal Boaz Yisrael. Give me 1 second here. Sorry, it's just loading here. Okay, here we go. So this is what the tombstone of Order Crescent looks like when it is discovered on the Mountain of Olives. Now, if you can read that clearly, I'll circle the important part that we're worried about. So we have two Michals here. We have Michael and Michael. I assume both your names, your Hebrew names, are Michal. So this is right here, Michael, right? Mem Yod Chaf Yod.
Sure.
Yeah, it's kind of there's it's a little missing there, but that's where Michal is. Boaz, and the beginning of Yisrael, and the rest of it. It was either that this was the stone and they ran out of space, or maybe it came down to this side here, a little unclear. But this is definitely the tombstone for Michal Yisrael, Michal Boaz Yisrael on the Mountain of Olives. Now there was a ceremony made by the Americans to commemorate the first consul to Jerusalem shortly before the ceremony to move the embassy to Jerusalem, which, by the way, I got a message before, and I just hope it remains true, that the new Secretary of State in his Senate hearings said that the capital of Israel is Jerusalem and the embassy will stay in Jerusalem. So, and first of all, he's right, the capital is Jerusalem, and I'm just glad that he's saying publicly in the Senate that the capital will stay there. It should just remain true. But so this is the
Jewish,
life.
so that helps.
What's that? Yeah. Yes and no. Yes and no. I have mixed feelings on Jewish politicians personally. Now, on one hand, when we look at the success of the Trump administration in the Middle East, a lot of that is because, let's face it, he let his Jewish son-in-law and his Jewish advisors, operate untouched in the Middle East to make it happen. By the way, I will point out here that Avi Berkowitz, who was one of the architects of the Abraham Accords, is an alumnus of my yeshiva. He's a lot younger than me, as you probably know, but he was a Ner Yisrael alumni. But okay, so that was Jews very much. So hopefully Jews in the administration will be a good thing. On the flip side, let's not forget there are Jews throughout history, like the famous quote from Henry Kissinger, that when he met Golda Meir for the first time, he said, Golda, I have to tell you that I am first I'm first an American, second the Secretary of State, and third a Jew. To which Golda Meir responded, Henry, you know that in Israel we read from right to left. So, the fact that there's high-ranking Jews, I have mixed it. Yeah, you could bring case studies both ways in American politics and any politics of if that's a good thing or a bad thing. Again, talking about Israel, I'm blanking on his name. The governor to Palestine, the British governor to Palestine. Senior moment. The Jewish British governor to Palestine, Sir Samuel Balfour, the Jewish one. Samuel, not Samuel Balfour. No, it's yeah. Anyways, my daughter's Googling it for me. It was in 1922, I believe. Google the British governor of Palestine in 1922. I'm just blanking on his name. But it was terrible. It was terrible for, everyone thought when he became the British governor in Palestine, it was going to be wonderful. And he was a somewhat traditional Jew himself, and ended up being terrible. And not only was it terrible, that in one of his most atrocious acts was that he was the one who appointed, or who created, or really who appointed the Mufti of Jerusalem, none other than Haj Amin al-Husseini Yamach Shemo, who was the Mufti of Jerusalem during World War II, who allied himself with Hitler, who was a terrible anti-Semite. And frankly, you can we talk about the modern day, was that? Herbert Samuel, Lord Herbert Samuel, that was his name. I was right about the Samuel, Lord Herbert Samuel. So a lot of the modern day conflict and really the fanaticism amongst the Arabs in Israel, we can attribute to Haj Amin al-Husseini, and he's appointed by Lord Herbert Samuel, by the Jewish governor. So that's why don't always get too excited because you see a Jew in high places. It can put it like Samuel, it put him in a position where he felt he couldn't play the Jewish card too much, because unlike Trump, who didn't look at Kushner and Berkowitz, what they were doing, or whatever, it was not the case in England, and therefore I would say that let's wait to see how it plays out. But I'm glad that at least in the Senate hearings, the statement was made that Jerusalem is the capital and that the embassy will stay put. Okay, I see that Nicole is raising her hand. What do you got for me, Nicole?
Hey, so I put a link in the text, or in the chat box, and there's an artist that lived around the turn of the 20th century named John Singer Sargent, and he had an exhibit for a long time at the Met. I don't know if it's still there. It's this room, and it's all of these paintings of Israel. I think he went once in the late 1800s and once like in around 1905 and 1906. But all of it's just like, it's like all of the paintings show that it's very uninhabited, and they're very cool to see. They're not as cool to see on a computer screen as they are when you walk into these big rooms and see these massive 12 feet long paintings. But they're their paintings, I have a couple examples of them. They're very the descriptions very much match that of the authors that traveled there. But he was also very sympathetic to the Jewish people in New York. So he's an American impressionist, and he did a lot of portraits of Jewish people around the turn of the beginning of the 19th or 20th century, the end of 19th century. So yeah, those paintings really kind of just matched what the descriptions where you gave.
Yeah, awesome. These are beautiful. Yeah, thank you. It's interesting is I don't think we can let this idea slip by, because the way that humankind tends to be is whatever our reality is, the miraculous nature of it can often be lost. And when we look at the land of Israel today, the fact that it has been developed, that you have Israel is the first water independent country in the world. America is technically not water independent, and Israel in the middle of a desert is, and that they've literally made the desert sprout. We've made the desert sprout. And the fact that you have many you have different produce and whatnot that is now, I think this was the #1 producer of baby tomatoes. I think baby tomatoes, if they weren't Israeli created, they became a thing from Israel. And then you see that the Ottomans for 500 years did nothing with it. The Crusaders did nothing with it. The early Muslims did nothing with it. The Byzantines did nothing with it. No one cared about it, right? It was a backwater part of the country. It was never cared about. It was only cared about in modern times when the Jews do something with it, right? And when we see the prophecies of our prophets come true, of the land sprouting and that doesn't happen for others because it is miraculous. Like Melville said, it would take a miracle. It did take a miracle, and the miracle should never be lost on us. The fact that if it wasn't for COVID, we could go drive down to Hopkins Airport and buy a ticket to we have to go first to either New York or Toronto, but buy a ticket to Israel and be there within 18 hours. It's an amazing thing. And the fact that it's such a developed country and agriculturally developed and technologically developed, and then we think about our grandparents and our great grandparents and what they went through as whether they were the first ones in our families to come to America, whether they were still in Europe, whatever it was. And if we would wake any of them up right now and say, hey, did you know that in the year 2021, there's going to be a majority of the world Jewish population in the land of Israel, and it's going to be a #1 tech center and #1 in many agricultural departments, #1 in irrigation and in water development and all these wonderful things. They would have said, what are you smoking, kid? You've been smoking some Middle East hashish there. That's what they would have thought. Yet we are witness to it. So, for people who say that they don't believe in miracles, or if they only would see a miracle, then they become a believer. Well, just open your eyes and look at the land of Israel. And again, there's challenges there. I don't want to minimize the challenges. I mean, talk about miracles. I think it's the only country in modern times that's going to have 4 elections within a year. I mean, but again, you could talk about consolidating power, like people thought after the last one that Bibi was done for, and sure enough, he's right back on top. It's pretty just from a socio-political standpoint, it's an amazing story. but be it as it may, it's miraculous. And people like Cression saw it early and believed in it early as proto-Zionists. I'm always one to say, and I think it's important, that Zionism has to be mixed with the Torah to make sense, because if it's just a secular nationalistic movement, that lasts as long as you're a pioneer, as long as you're a revolutionist, but then for your kids, it's a bankrupt idea. And that's what you see, unfortunately, amongst a lot of secular Israelis, that their parents and grandparents were the pioneers of the country, but it was done from a place of nationalism, because that was the time period of nationalism in the world, or just after the time period of nationalism. And there's no more, once you have the country, it's nationalism wears away. So if it's not based in something deeper and something more meaningful, then it's going to be really hard to transmit to your kids. And I remember, I guess it was probably 2 or 3 years ago, one of the there's a play that came through from Israel. It was at that playhouse in Cleveland Heights, the Dobama,
yes.
right? Right. So there's a play called Off the Grill, I think it was called. Naomi and I went to see it. I think it's called Off the Grill. A great play, which brought out this idea of the challenge of secular Israelis to convey a belief of a Jewish homeland to their children without Torah. And again, it wasn't a religious play, but that was the underlying theme of it. That it was saying that the nationalism wears off after a few years. Tell these kids that they have mandatory conscription. Tell these kids that they have to go fight for something. Why? I'm going to just move to a different country. Why do I have to do it? Why do I have to work on the kibbutz? Why? This isn't meaningful to me. And I think that's why it's so important that when we talk about Israel, it has to be talked about in a framework of Torah and a framework of the prophecy and the framework of where this fits into the national Jewish story for 3,300 years, because otherwise it becomes a meaningless story. There's just another one more point on this, and then I'll go back to the questions. That I was very distraught a few years ago. This was back when we still had these things called dinners and banquets and events. I don't I tell my kids about it. They think I'm making it up. There used to be such a thing that people would go out. There'd be a couple hundred people there. We'd eat food that isn't usually that great, and we'd hear speakers, and we'd have to donate some money. And I think I'm making the whole thing up. But anyhow, there was a dinner for a certain organization, and there was a certain prominent religious Zionist speaker. It was I don't want to say the organization, I don't want to say the speaker, but it was a organization and a prominent religious Zionist speaker. And the general theme of this organization, and the dinner at least, not necessarily the organization, the dinner was, it's important to support Israel because why? Because of never again. So there should never be another Holocaust, and if God forbid there's ever anti-Semitism in the world, the Jews will have a place to run. And I remember afterwards talking to some of the shluchim that we have here in Cleveland, some of the, we have these young Israeli families that come to work in the schools. You have the Shimshanim, the single kids that come, and you also have the shluchim and Mizrahi and Fix Mizrahi school. And so I was talking to some of my friends who are shluchim here, and I said, and they were at the dinner too. I said, did that bother you? They said, yeah, it bothered us a lot. And I said, why? And they said, because if all Eretz Yisrael means to somebody is never again, and the only reason and justification you can give that the Jews should have a homeland is so when they come to slaughter us next time, we'll have a place to run. Well, that's not going to necessarily resonate with kids. And they were saying from their experience in the IDF, this has become a big issue. in the IDF that this, now they're religious young men, they're religious Army reservists, but amongst non-religious, that why should I fight? Never again. That's so 75 years ago. What do I need to worry about that for? Or 80 years ago. Like those are great grandparents at this point. What do I need to worry about that for? And that's why I think it's so important when we talk about Israel. And we're going to talk about a lot more in our next series. But when we talk about Israel, we have to talk about it in a framework of the Torah, in a framework of Yisrael, the Oraisa, the Kudsha, Brichu, Chadhu. There's a concept of God, the Jewish people, and the Torah are all one. And that is definitely the case with the land of Israel, which is our homeland as the people of Israel. Okay, back to any other questions from the
There we
people.
go.
Okay,
Have a
go
good
for it,
night,
Michael.
everyone.
All right, take care, Michael. Have a good evening. Thank you. Thank you.
Of course.
Thank you for being here. 2 times in a week. I'm a lucky man. So, okay.
We're going to try to keep that up.
Yeah, awesome. Awesome. Anyone else before we wrap it up? Any other questions, comments, concerns, good jokes, bad jokes? So Joanne's saying that she set a book in undergrad with the 3 aspects of Jewish identity, and she's trying to find it. Thank you. I appreciate that. So the flyer, we have an updated flyer, but I don't think it was sent to me yet for next week. So I'll just give you the oral information for next week in case you missed the email that went out last night. But our next series is beginning a week from tonight, and it's called The 10 Paths to a New You, and is going to be a multimedia program where every session will start off with some teachings from Rabbi Jonathan Sachs, Zichron Livracha, because we're going to be using his curriculum called 10 Paths of God. And so start off with some of his content, and then we will segue into a conversation with myself and our guests for the evening. And all our guests are 10 of the most sought after Jewish speakers in the Jewish world. And then we'll wrap up with a few more thoughts from myself and a group discussion on the topic. And next week, we will be talking about the topic of identity, of Jewish identity. And our guest speaker will be Cleveland's own Ben-Zion Klotzko, Hebrew Academy graduate, amazing speaker, founder of Shabbat.com, the founder of the OME Campus Outreach Program, and like I said, Cleveland native. So look forward to that. Next week is going to be a very exciting program. Yeah, Joanne, I see your virtual hand is up.
So the whole time when Cression was there in Israel, before he came back, was he acting, how long did he act as the consul general, as the consul to Jerusalem, even though the offer was rescinded? Or was everything kind of, he was doing it independently and sort of with the title? I mean, because obviously they couldn't pick up a phone then and say, you need to leave. Right.
So what basically happened is when the letter came that his appointment had been rescinded before it even started, it was only a minor setback for him. He continued to function as the consul. He continued to call himself the consul. He continued to greet foreign dignitaries as a representative of the United States of America. And no one said boo, because the Ottomans didn't particularly care. And there were no officials from America that were coming that would ask the questions, because like you said, no one could pick up the phone. No one was getting American papers, no internet. There was only so much communication back and forth. So whether or not word of the fact that he was still functioning as a representative, as a diplomat of America, even made it back to Washington, he went on just doing his thing for 4 years. And it was only when he returned, the only reason that he ceased to do that when he returned was because he had a different mission. It wasn't because anyone necessarily told him not to. He could have gone on doing it, and no one probably would have said, no one would have said anything to him. But it was by the virtue of the fact that he had a new mission, that he sought to build up the country agriculturally. So yeah, he functioned full-fledged as the consulate with the name given by himself, called by himself. He made a seal. He made an office, but he was basically self-appointed at that point, because Calhoun had definitely rescinded it, and the government of the United States of America had rescinded it fully at that point. So
how did he, I mean, I know that he was wealthy. How did he continue to support himself if he's obviously not earning any kind of a salary from the US government? Did he just go over on the boat with suitcases full of cash or gold or something and it lasted as long as it lasted?
So that's a good question.
No.
I don't know the physical mechanics of it, but at least part of the encouragement of the State Department to accept him as the consul was the fact that he was not going to be taking a salary.
Okay.
That was one of the selling points to Calhoun to appoint him. So whatever, however it was set up in those days, like you said, was it suitcases of gold? This is before Rothschild and their pigeons, I believe. I think that's not till a few decades later, if I'm right. About the same time, I guess. But whatever. There was no international commerce at that point per se, without people to facilitate that international commerce. So I guess, yeah, something like you said, he went over with enough wealthy jewels and gold, and again, it had to be something that obviously he could turn into usable items. Also, he'd go over with a $50,000 diamond, and if there's no one in Israel to buy it, it's not going to get him very far, right? I mean, it's was he able to get Ottoman currency, whatever Ottoman currency there was? But again, it would be coins. It wouldn't be paper bills. It wouldn't be a bank account per se. So yeah, I guess your assumption is probably right, that it was some sort of, he went over with bags and bags of gold to support himself.
And did he, I'm assuming he had to study for a long time with this Sephardi rabbi in Jerusalem before he was able to convert.
Yeah. Well, again, remember that his studies in many ways began when he was still in Philadelphia. It wasn't as if he got to Israel and was now starting from scratch to study Jerusalem and to study Judaism. And also, I would point out that as we talked about both with Gordon last week and the Ger Tzedek the week before, that Quakerism, if that's the right term, is a form of Protestantism, and it is a division of Christianity that does believe in reading the Bible. So a lot of the questions he had started to ask already, from the age of 30, and doesn't convert to the age of 50. So it's a 20-year odyssey, really. So yeah, it was a lot of study, but it was a very long odyssey. Sorry. So he began his search at the age of 30, roughly, is what the books say, and it was 49 when he converted. So a 19-year odyssey from beginning to end. And it's a fascinating story on so many levels. Number one, the fact that he has this title of first consul of Israel, of Jerusalem. Number two, that he this law, at the time was a groundbreaking law that you could not call somebody insane and based on having a changing their religion midlife. That does not cause for a decree of insanity. It's a big court case at the time, and it's right here at the hands of our very own Micho Boaz Yisrael. Okay, any other questions, comments, concerns before we wrap it up?
Excellent class, Rabbi. Excellent.
Thank you so much. I appreciate you all being here, and get psyched up for our new series starting next week. I'm psyched up for it. I'm very excited for it. We've put a lot of work into this one, securing the speakers and the process of getting ready with the speakers. So we are very, very excited for this next one. It's going to be a lot of fun. So be sure to tell your friends, tell your acquaintances, tell your enemies, and they can watch it with us here on Zoom or on Facebook or YouTube or later on TorahAnytime.com. So thank you very much, and everybody have a wonderful, wonderful evening.